The CEO of a tech company watched as a poor student fixed his father's computer. When he opened his briefcase the next day, everyone in the room fell silent. Marcus Johnson walked the same route to college every morning at exactly 7:15 a.m. The spring sun warmed his face as he adjusted the worn laptop bag on his shoulder, its strap frayed from years of use. As he passed the row of modest apartment buildings on Cedar Street, his eyes automatically drifted to the second-floor window where Mr. Chin sat every morning. Today was different. The elderly man wasn't calmly reading his newspaper as usual. Instead, he was hunched over his desk, his hands pressed against his temples in visible frustration. Marcus's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, seeing Mrs. Harrison's name on the screen, a regular client who always paid well for computer repairs. "Hello, Mrs. Harrison," he answered, still watching Mr. Chun through the window. "Marcus, dear, my computer's acting up again. Those pop-ups are back, and I can't access my banking website. Could you come by today? I'll pay your usual rate plus a little extra for the short notice." Marcus's stomach tightened. He needed the money. The electricity bill was due in 3 days, and his mother's paycheck wouldn't cover all their expenses this month. But Mr. Chin's distress was impossible to ignore. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Harrison. I'm actually booked solid today. Can we schedule for tomorrow morning?" "Oh, well, I suppose I could wait. Though I really needed to pay some bills today. I'll make it up to you. First thing tomorrow, I promise." After hanging up, Marcus stood still for a moment, watching as Mr. Chin slammed his mouse down on the desk. The old man's shoulders shook slightly, and even from the street, Marcus could see him wipe his eyes. "Damn it," Marcus muttered, turning toward Mr. Chin's building entrance. The security door's lock was broken again, typical for their neighborhood. He climbed the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stairwell. Standing before apartment 2B, Marcus took a deep breath. He'd seen Mr. Chin almost every day for the past year, but had never spoken to him beyond a polite "good morning." The sound of something hitting a desk came from inside, followed by a frustrated cry in Mandarin. Marcus knocked 3 times. Shuffling footsteps approached. The door opened, revealing Mr. Chun in a gray cardigan and wire-rimmed glasses. His eyes were red. "Yes." Mr. Chin's voice was rough with emotion. "Hi, Mr. Chin. I'm Marcus from downstairs. I couldn't help but notice you were having some computer trouble." The older man's shoulders slumped. "Oh, yes, but I cannot afford repair service right now. My pension." "No charge," Marcus said quickly. "I'm studying computer science at the community college. I'd be happy to take a look." Mr. Chin hesitated. "You would do this? For free?" "Of course. We're neighbors, right?" The apartment was small, but meticulously clean. Family photos lined the walls. Mr. Chun with a younger woman who shared his smile, an elderly lady who must have been his wife, graduation ceremonies, birthdays. A framed certificate from the local university hung prominently, in recognition of Professor James Chin's 30 years of distinguished service to the history department. The computer setup was on a small desk by the window where Marcus always saw him. An ancient Dell desktop computer hummed loudly, its fan working overtime. The monitor displayed a frozen Skype window. "It's my daughter," Mr. Chin explained, his voice cracking. "She lives in Singapore now. We try to video call every week, but lately, I cannot make it work." The screen freezes, the sound cuts out. "Today would have been my wife's birthday. Amy, my daughter, she wanted to share some special news." Marcus set his bag down and pulled up a chair. "Let me take a look, Professor Chun. Please call me James. I haven't been Professor Chun since I retired 2 years ago." Marcus began working, checking processes, clearing cache, running diagnostics. As his fingers moved across the keyboard, he asked, "You taught history?" "For 30 years. World history, primarily focusing on Asian civilizations. The students always enjoyed my stories about growing up in Hong Kong. Must have been amazing, seeing history through your students' eyes all those years." Mr. Chin smiled for the first time. It was. Each semester brought new perspectives, new questions. But now, he gestured at the computer. "Technology moves so fast. I feel left behind." Marcus nodded, still typing. "Technology should connect people, not isolate them. That's why I love working with computers. When they work right, they bring people together. The next hour passed quickly. Marcus cleared out malware, updated drivers, optimized settings. He walked Mr. Chun through each step, explaining in simple terms what he was doing and why. There, Marcus said finally, "Try calling Amy now." Mr. Chen's hands shook slightly as he clicked the video call button. The screen lit up, and a young woman's face appeared, crystal clear. "Dad? The video's working perfectly. I can see you so clearly." Tears welled up in Mr. Chen's eyes. "Amy, I can see you too, sweetheart." Marcus quietly packed his bag, giving them privacy. As he headed for the door, Mr. Chen called out, "Marcus, wait." The elderly man hurried over, reaching for his wallet. "Please, let me pay you something." "No need, Mr. Chun. Just say hi to me in the mornings when I walk by." Mr. Chen's eyes crinkled. "Every morning." "Thank you, Marcus. You don't know what this means." "Dad?" Amy's voice came from the computer. "Who's that with you?" "Come meet my young friend," Mr. Chen said, gently pulling Marcus back to the desk. "He's the one who made this possible." Marcus spent another 15 minutes chatting with Mr. Chun and Amy. He learned she was a software engineer, that she was expecting her first child, the special news she'd wanted to share on her mother's birthday, and that Mr. Chun had been feeling increasingly isolated since his wife passed away 2 years ago. When Marcus finally left, the sun was high in the sky. He'd missed his morning classes, lost a paying client, and would have to stay up late to catch up on studying. But seeing Mr. Chen's face light up when Amy's image appeared on screen made it all worth it. Walking down the stairs, Marcus couldn't know that his simple act of kindness had set much bigger events in motion. He couldn't know that someone else had been watching, or that his life was about to change dramatically. All he knew was that he'd done the right thing, even if his wallet disagreed. He checked his phone. 3 missed calls from his mother, probably wondering why he wasn't in class. As he reached the building's entrance, he noticed a sleek black car pulling up to the curb, but he was too preoccupied with composing an explanatory text to pay it much attention. The spring sun was still warm on his face as he headed home, but now it felt different somehow. Like maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something new. The interior of Mr. Chen's apartment felt warmer in the afternoon light. Marcus sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor, surrounded by old photographs that had spilled from a dusty album. Mr. Chen had insisted he stay for tea after fixing another computer issue, and somehow one cup had turned into 3 hours of stories. "This one," Mr. Chen said, carefully lifting a faded color photograph, "was taken the day I received tenure." 1985, he handed it to Marcus, who studied the younger version of his neighbor standing proudly in front of the university's main building, his arm around a beautiful woman in a red dress. "Your wife?" Marcus asked, noting the same gentle smile he'd seen in other photos. "Yes, Margaret. She always said that was her favorite photo of us." Mr. Chen's voice grew soft. "She was the one who convinced me to leave Hong Kong, to pursue a teaching position here. Adventure, she called it." Marcus set the photo down carefully. The computer hummed quietly in the background, running the updates he'd installed. "How did you meet?" "In a library, of all places." Mr. Chen laughed, the sound brightening the room. "I was researching for my thesis, buried in books about the Tang Dynasty. She was the new librarian, recently graduated. She kept bringing me more books than I requested, saying I might find them interesting. It took me 3 weeks to realize she was flirting." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room. Marcus should have been heading home. He had assignments due tomorrow, but Mr. Chen's stories held him captive. The elderly man moved to his desk, opening a drawer. "Look at this," he said, pulling out a worn leather case. Inside was a gold pocket watch, its face slightly clouded with age. "Margaret's graduation gift to me when I completed my doctorate. She had it engraved." Marcus turned the watch over. On the back was inscribed, "Time gives wisdom. Love gives meaning." "She always had a way with words," Mr. Chen said, his fingers tracing the engraving. "Much better than my broken English when I first arrived." The computer chimed, indicating the updates were complete. Marcus stood, stretching his stiff legs. "Let's make sure everything's working properly now." They moved to the desk, where Marcus had spent the past few hours not just fixing technical issues, but teaching Mr. Chun how to prevent them. The elderly man pulled up his chair, his movements more confident than they had been that morning. Show me again how to save the photos Amy sends, Mr. Chen requested, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Marcus leaned in, pointing to different icons. Remember, right-click here, then Save As. Choose the folder we created. See it? Family Photos. Mr. Chen's face lit up as he successfully saved a recent photo of Amy. Ah, yes, I remember now. And to make it bigger, just click here, Marcus guided. You're getting really good at this, Mr. Chun. James, please. After all these hours, I think we can drop the formality. He smiled, successfully enlarging the photo. You know, I was terrified of computers when I first started teaching. Had to learn quickly, though. The university moved everything online in my last few years. Marcus nodded. That must have been challenging. Incredibly. But Margaret, Mr. Chen's voice caught slightly. She would sit with me for hours, helping me learn. Just like you're doing now. A notification popped up on screen. Another video call from Amy. Mr. Chen answered with barely any hesitation, his earlier frustration replaced with confident movements. Dad, twice in one day. This must be a record. Amy's face appeared, clearer than ever after Marcus's adjustments to the settings. Your father's becoming a tech expert, Marcus said, grinning as Mr. Chen navigated to the newly saved photos without prompting. I can see that. Amy laughed. Dad, have you shown Marcus your photo albums yet? I bet he'd love to see your old university pictures. We've been going through them all afternoon, Mr. Chun replied proudly. Marcus, look, this is Amy when she first started coding. Always taking things apart, trying to see how they worked. The photo showed a young Amy, surrounded by dismantled computer parts, a determined expression on her face. Marcus couldn't help but smile. Like father, like daughter, always teaching or learning. They talked for another hour, Amy sharing stories about her tech projects in Singapore, while Mr. Chen practiced sharing screens and sending files. Marcus watched as the elderly man grew more comfortable with each operation, his fears of technology melting away with each small success. As the sun began to set, Marcus's phone buzzed, his mother again. He grimaced, knowing he'd have to explain why he'd missed a full day of classes. I should head home, he said reluctantly, gathering his laptop bag. Mr. Chun stood quickly. Wait, please. Let me give you something for your time. All these hours. Marcus shook his head. No need. Really. This was... He paused, looking at the photos spread across the floor, the smiling face of Amy on the screen, the way Mr. Chen's hands now moved confidently over the keyboard. This was worth more than money. At least let me make you dinner, Mr. Chen insisted. I may not be able to pay you, but I can share my wife's recipe for dumplings. She always said food was the best way to show gratitude. Before Marcus could protest, Amy chimed in from the screen. Oh, you have to try Dad's dumplings. Mom made him learn the recipe before she passed. He's actually really good at it. The smell of garlic and ginger soon filled the small apartment. Marcus sat at the kitchen counter, watching Mr. Chen's precise movements as he folded each dumpling with practiced care. They talked about everything and nothing. Mr. Chen's students over the years, Marcus's dreams of starting his own tech company, Amy's upcoming baby. Technology is wonderful, Mr. Chen said as he placed a steaming plate in front of Marcus. But it's the people behind it that matter. Margaret understood that. She would have liked you, Marcus. You have the same kindness in your eyes. Marcus took a bite of dumpling, the flavors exploding in his mouth. These are amazing. The secret is in the folding technique, Mr. Chen explained, demonstrating with another wrapper. Each fold must be perfect, or the filling escapes during cooking. Like many things in life, it requires patience and attention to detail. As they ate, the computer ran quietly in the background, no longer a source of frustration, but a bridge between worlds. Through the window, Marcus could see his own apartment building, knowing his mother would be worried. But somehow, sitting here, learning to fold dumplings from an elderly professor while his daughter watched and offered tips from thousands of miles away, felt exactly where he needed to be. When Marcus finally left that evening, his bag was heavier with a container of leftover dumplings, and his heart was fuller with stories of a life well lived. Mr. Chen stood in the doorway, waving goodbye. Remember, the elderly man called out, same time tomorrow? You promised to show me how to organize my email folders. Marcus turned back, grinning. Wouldn't miss it. As he descended the stairs, the weight of missed classes and assignments pressed against his conscience. But the sound of Mr. Chin's laughter, mixed with Amy's voice from the computer, echoed in his mind. Sometimes, he realized the most important lessons happened outside the classroom. He couldn't know that upstairs, Mr. Chin was already making an important phone call. Couldn't know that his simple act of kindness had set wheels in motion that would change everything. All he knew was that tomorrow, he'd be back, ready to build another bridge across the digital divide. The stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter seemed to stare at Marcus as he entered his apartment. His mother, Sarah, sat at their small dining table, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a double shift, her expression a mix of concern and exhaustion. 2 missed classes today, she said quietly, pushing a cup of coffee toward him. Want to tell me what's going on? Marcus set down the container of dumplings. I was helping Mr. Chun with his computer. Remember the elderly man upstairs I told you about? The retired professor? Sarah took a sip of her coffee. Marcus, honey, I know your heart's in the right place, but we can't afford to, Mom. Marcus opened the container, the aroma of ginger and garlic filling their small kitchen. Try one of these first, then lecture me. She sighed but took a dumpling. Her eyes widened at the first bite. Okay, these are incredible. But still, he needed help connecting with his daughter. Video calls weren't working. She's in Singapore, about to have a baby. Today was his wife's birthday, and Marcus trailed off, watching his mother's expression soften. You're too much like your father sometimes, she said, but her tone was gentle. Always putting others first. Marcus glanced at the photo on their wall. His father in his mechanic's uniform, smiling broadly, arm around a younger version of his mother. 10 years gone, but his lessons about helping others whenever possible still guided Marcus's decisions. The electric bill is due Friday, Sarah said, pulling him back to reality. And your textbook deposit for next semester. I know. I'll figure something out. Maybe pick up some extra repair jobs this weekend. His mother reached across the table, squeezing his hand. You're a good boy, Marcus. But sometimes being good doesn't pay the bills. He managed a small smile. Dad used to say that too. Later that night, Marcus sat at his desk, trying to focus on coding assignments. His laptop screen blurred as fatigue set in. Through his window, he could see Mr. Chin's apartment still lit, the elderly man's silhouette moving about, probably practicing the computer skills they'd worked on. His phone buzzed, Mrs. Harrison again. Marcus? I hate to bother you so late, but my daughter is saying I need to pay these bills tonight. He rubbed his eyes. Mrs. Harrison, I'm so sorry about today. First thing tomorrow, I promise. I'll come before my classes. Well, Wilson Computer Repair said they could come tonight. They charge more, but... No, wait. Marcus sat up straighter. I'll come now. Give me 20 minutes. After hanging up, he stared at his unfinished assignment. Professor Zhang wasn't going to accept another late submission. His grade was already slipping. A soft knock at his door. Honey, I made some tea. Sarah entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs. Her eyes fell on his open laptop. Then the time, 11:45 p.m. Mrs. Harrison needs help with her computer. Tonight. Marcus stood, gathering his repair tools. I can still finish this assignment after. Probably. When was the last time you slept more than 5 hours? Sleep is for people who don't have bills due on Friday. He attempted a joke, but his mother's frown deepened. Marcus Johnson, sit down for a minute. He recognized that tone, the one that brooked no argument. He sat. Your father worked himself sick trying to take care of everyone else. Free repairs for neighbors. Staying late at the shop for customers who couldn't pay full price. She took a shaky breath. His heart gave out because he never knew when to stop giving. Mom, I'm proud of you for helping Mr. Chun. But you have to find balance. Your education has to come first. Marcus looked out his window again. Mr. Chun was at his computer, the blue screen light illuminating his face. He was smiling, probably on another call with Amy. What if it's not just about fixing computers? Marcus said slowly. What if it's about, I don't know, making connections? Mr. Chin was so isolated before. Now he can see his daughter, talk to her, share moments. Sarah's expression softened. Like I said, too much like your father. She stood, kissing the top of his head. Go help Mrs. Harrison. But promise me you'll come right back and finish your assignment. Promise. He hugged her quickly, grabbing his bag. The night air was cool as Marcus walked the 3 blocks to Mrs. Harrison's house. Street lights cast long shadows, and somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed briefly before falling silent. His phone buzzed again, a message from Amy, Mr. Chin's daughter. "Thank you for helping Dad today. He's been so different since this morning. More alive somehow. I've been worried about him being alone since Mom died, but knowing he has a friend like you nearby, it means everything." Marcus smiled, typing back a quick response as he walked. He didn't notice the black luxury car parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing the occupant who watched him with great interest. Mrs. Harrison's computer problems took longer than expected, a complicated virus that required several system scans. By the time Marcus returned home, it was nearly 3 a.m. His assignment remained unfinished, his eyes burned with exhaustion, and his mother's words about his father echoed in his mind. Still, as he passed Mr. Chin's building, he looked up at the now-dark window and couldn't regret his choices. Tomorrow would be another day of juggling studies, repairs, and bills. But for now, he had helped bridge a gap between a father and daughter, and somehow that felt like enough. He couldn't know that in a high-rise office across town, someone was making plans that would change his life forever. Couldn't know that his small acts of kindness had caught the attention of someone with the power to open doors he'd never dreamed possible. As he finally crawled into bed, the first hints of dawn creeping through his window, Marcus's last thought was of Mr. Chin's wife's engraving. Time gives wisdom. Love gives meaning. The morning would bring more than just another day. It would bring an unexpected visitor who would turn his world upside down. But for now, Marcus slept, unaware that his simple decision to help a neighbor was about to lead to something extraordinary. Through his window, the same black car that had been watching him remained parked in the shadows, its engine quietly idling. The knock came at precisely 8 a.m., 3 sharp raps that echoed through the Johnsons' small apartment. Marcus, still groggy from his late night, barely registered the sound until his mother called from the kitchen. "Marcus? Someone's at the door." He stumbled out of bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Through the peephole, he saw a tall man in an impeccable blue suit, holding a leather briefcase. The hallway's fluorescent lights reflected off his silver hair. Marcus opened the door, immediately conscious of his wrinkled t-shirt and messy hair. "Marcus Johnson?" The man's voice was crisp, authoritative. His eyes, dark and intelligent, took in every detail of the modest apartment behind Marcus. "Yes, my name is David Wong. May I come in?" Before Marcus could respond, his mother appeared beside him, still in her night robe. "Wong? As in Wong Technologies?" The man smiled slightly. "The same, though I'm here today more as a son than a so." Marcus's tired brain finally caught up. Wong Technologies, one of the largest tech companies in the country. "And this man, you're Mr. Chin's son?" "Indeed." David Wong stepped into their apartment, his polished leather shoes incongruous against the worn carpet. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning." Sarah quickly gathered her robe tighter. "Not at all. Please sit down. Can I offer you some coffee?" "That would be lovely, thank you." Marcus watched as David Wong settled onto their threadbare couch, placing his briefcase carefully beside him. The morning sun streaming through the window highlighted the expensive cut of his suit, the gleam of his gold watch. "I apologize for the early hour," David said, his posture perfect despite the sagging cushions. "But I wanted to catch you before your classes." Marcus sat in the armchair across from him, heart pounding. Had he done something wrong? Was Mr. Chin upset about something? Sarah returned with coffee in their least chipped mugs, setting them on the coffee table with shaking hands. "Mr. Johnson," David began, then paused. "May I call you Marcus?" "Of course." "Marcus, I spent several hours on the phone with my father last night." He took a sip of coffee, nodding appreciatively at Sarah. "He told me about what you did for him. It was nothing really, just some basic computer maintenance," and David held up a hand. "It was far from nothing. For months, I've been trying to convince my father to move to Singapore, to be closer to Amy and me, or at least to accept full-time care. His isolation was becoming concerning." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. He seems pretty independent to me. He is. Stubbornly so. A fond smile crossed David's face. But independence doesn't have to mean isolation. Do you know what he said to me last night? Marcus shook his head. He said, "For the first time since your mother died, I feel connected again." David leaned forward, his eyes intense. Do you understand what that means? Sarah had settled on the arm of Marcus's chair, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. My father, David continued, spent 30 years teaching young people about the past. Now, thanks to you, he's finally able to embrace the future. Not just the technology itself, but what it represents: connection, community, family. He reached for his briefcase, and Marcus tensed. The room seemed to hold its breath. When Amy told me about your help, I did some research. David unlatched the briefcase with deliberate movements. You're studying computer science at the community college, working repair jobs to help with expenses, maintaining a 3.8 GPA despite working part-time. Marcus glanced at his mother, who squeezed his shoulder. What you may not know, David pulled out a folder, is that Wong Technologies is launching a new initiative. Digital inclusion for seniors. Teaching older adults to use technology, not just functionally, but meaningfully. He opened the folder, revealing glossy documents with the Wong Technologies logo. The problem we've faced is finding the right people to lead these programs. People who understand both the technical aspects and the human element. People with patience, empathy, and... He gestured toward Mr. Chen's building visible through the window, a natural ability to bridge generations. Marcus's throat felt dry. Mr. Wong, please call me David. He pulled out another document. This is an offer for a paid internship at Wong Technologies. Full benefits, flexible hours around your classes, and a clear path to permanent employment after graduation. Sarah's grip on Marcus's shoulder tightened. I don't know what to say. Say nothing yet. David reached into the briefcase one final time. First, look at this. He handed Marcus a tablet. On the screen was a video feed, Mr. Chen's apartment. The elderly man was already at his computer, video chatting with what looked like a whole group of people. That's his old faculty group, David explained. They try to meet monthly online, but Dad could never get the conference call features to work before. This morning, he set it up himself. He's been on that call for an hour, reconnecting with colleagues he hasn't properly spoken to in years. Marcus watched as Mr. Chen laughed at something one of his friends said, his face animated, hands gesturing as he told what was probably one of his historical anecdotes. You did that, David said quietly. Not by just fixing his computer, but by giving him the confidence to use it. By showing him that technology isn't his enemy. Sarah spoke for the first time since serving the coffee. This internship, what exactly would it involve? David turned to her. Marcus would help develop and implement our senior digital literacy program. Starting right here in this neighborhood, we'd provide all the resources, equipment, training materials, everything. He'd work directly with me and our development team. The salary? Sarah asked, ever practical. David named a figure that made both Marcus and his mother inhale sharply. Plus full health benefits, stock options, and he pulled out one final document, an immediate scholarship to cover the remainder of your college education. The room fell silent. Marcus stared at the papers spread across his coffee table, his future laid out in black and white. Why? He finally managed. Why me? David stood, straightening his suit jacket. Because in one day, you did what I've been trying to do for 2 years. You helped my father feel connected again. You showed him that technology could bring his family closer, not push them further apart. He walked to the window, looking out at his father's building. My mother's death hit him hard. I tried throwing money at the problem, offered to hire caregivers, buy him the latest gadgets. But what he needed wasn't more stuff. He needed someone to show him how to use what he already had. Turning back to Marcus, David's professional demeanor softened slightly. The world needs more people like you, Marcus. People who understand that technology is just a tool. It's how we use it that matters. Sarah stood, wiping tears from her eyes. It's more than generous. It's business, David said simply. Good business. We're not just offering Marcus a job. We're investing in our program's future. He picked up his briefcase. Take the weekend to think it over. All the details are in those documents. My direct number is on the last page. At the door, he paused. Oh, and Marcus? My father mentioned you missed some classes yesterday to help him. I took the liberty of calling your professors. They've agreed to give you extensions on any missed assignments. With that, he was gone, leaving behind only the smell of expensive cologne and a stack of papers that promised to change everything. Marcus sank back into his chair, stunned. Through the window, he could still see Mr. Chun in his apartment, animatedly sharing stories with his old colleagues, navigating the video chat controls like he'd been doing it for years. Sarah picked up the salary offer, her hands trembling slightly. Marcus, I know, Mom. I know. The morning sun filled their small living room, highlighting the worn furniture, the stack of bills on the counter, the faded photo of his father. Everything was about to change, and it had all started with a simple decision to help a neighbor. In Mr. Chen's apartment, laughter echoed through the computer speakers as the elderly professor reconnected with his past. In the Johnsons' apartment, mother and son stared at a future neither of them had imagined possible. The briefcase had held more than just papers. It had held hope. Marcus stood in front of Wong Technologies' glass and steel headquarters, his reflection distorted in the modern facade. He'd traded his usual t-shirt for a borrowed button-down shirt, slightly too big, borrowed from a neighbor, and had attempted to tame his hair into something professional. Deep breaths, he muttered to himself, clutching the signed contract in his messenger bag. After a weekend of discussions with his mother, countless pros and cons lists, and a long video call with Mr. Chin and Amy, he'd made his decision. The lobby was all polished marble and sleek metal, making his slightly scuffed shoes echo with each step. At the reception desk, a professionally dressed woman smiled at him. Marcus Johnson? Mr. Wong is expecting you. 18th floor. The elevator rode smoother than any he'd ever experienced. No rattling, no concerning noises like in his apartment building. Just a silent ascent that gave him too much time to think. David Wong's office occupied a corner of the 18th floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Mr. Chen sat in one of the plush visitors' chairs, beaming as Marcus entered. Ah, there he is. The elderly professor stood, clasping Marcus's shoulder. My tech genius. James insisted on being here, David explained from behind his massive desk. Said something about moral support. Marcus managed to smile, trying to calm his racing heart. I appreciate it. Sit. Mr. Chun urged, practically pushing Marcus into the chair beside him. Have you eaten? I brought dumplings. Dad, David sighed, but his expression was fond. This is a business meeting. Business can wait for dumplings, Mr. Chin declared, already opening a container he'd apparently brought with him. Margaret always said, never make big decisions on an empty stomach, David finished, shaking his head. Yes, Dad, we know. The familiar smell of ginger and garlic filled the executive office, somehow making the space feel less intimidating. Marcus accepted a dumpling, the taste reminding him of that first evening in Mr. Chen's apartment. Now then, David said once they'd eaten, pulling out the contract Marcus had brought. You've had time to review everything? Marcus nodded, swallowing his last bite. Yes, but I have some questions. Of course. The digital inclusion program. You want me to help develop it from scratch? David leaned back in his chair. Exactly. We have the technology, the resources, but we need someone who understands both the technical and human aspects. Someone who can bridge that gap. Like you did with me, Mr. Chun added proudly. Marcus fidgeted with his shirt cuff. But I'm just a student. I don't have any experience developing programs like this. That's precisely why we want you, David said. You're not bound by corporate thinking or traditional training methods. You proved that with my father. Mr. Chin nodded enthusiastically. This morning, I taught Mrs. Liu next door how to video chat with her grandchildren. Me, teaching someone else about computers. He chuckled. All because you made it simple, relatable. That's what we want to replicate, David explained. Not just teaching seniors to use technology, but empowering them to teach others. Creating a ripple effect. Marcus thought about Mrs. Harrison, how she'd struggled with online banking. About the other elderly residents in his building who felt left behind by the digital age. I have another question, he said, straightening in his chair. The salary, it's very generous. It's competitive for the industry. Almost too competitive for someone with my experience, Marcus pressed. Is this just because of your father? The room fell silent. Mr. Chen stopped mid-bite of his dumpling, looking between his son and Marcus. David stood, walking to the window. When my mother died, he said quietly, I threw money at the problem. Bought Dad the latest devices, hired people to help him. None of it worked. Want to know why? Marcus waited. Because they all treated him like a problem to solve, not a person to understand. David turned back. You did the opposite. You sat with him, listened to his stories, made technology feel like a bridge instead of a barrier. But the salary isn't charity, Marcus. It's investment. We're building something new here. Something that could help thousands of seniors reconnect with their families, their communities. Your approach, patience, empathy, practical solutions. That's worth every penny we're offering. Mr. Chun set down his container. Marcus, may I tell you something? Of course. When Margaret passed, I felt obsolete. My teaching career was over. I couldn't connect with Amy through this new technology. Everything moved too fast. He smiled gently. Then you showed me that an old professor could learn new tricks. That wisdom and innovation could work together. Dad, David said softly. Let me finish. Mr. Chen waved at his son. Marcus, you didn't just fix my computer. You gave me back my confidence, my connection to the world. How many others like me are out there, feeling left behind? Marcus thought about his father, how he'd always said that helping others was its own reward. But his mother's voice echoed too, about finding balance, about taking care of yourself while taking care of others. He reached into his bag, pulled out the signed contract. One more condition. David raised an eyebrow. Yes, Mr. Chin James needs to be part of the program. Not just as a participant, but as an advisor. His experience as an educator, combined with his perspective as a senior learning technology, it's valuable. David's face broke into a genuine smile. Already in the plans, though we hadn't told him yet. Mr. Chin's eyes widened. Me? But I barely know how to. You learned, Marcus interrupted. And now you're teaching others. That's exactly what this program needs. The elderly professor's eyes glistened. Margaret would have loved this. She always said technology should bring people together, not push them apart. Marcus handed the contract to David. She was right. David took the papers, already reaching for his pen. Welcome to Wong Technologies, Marcus. Shall we discuss your first project? The next hour passed in a blur of ideas and plans. Mr. Chun contributed enthusiastically, his professor's instincts emerging as they discussed teaching methods. David took notes on his tablet, occasionally making calls to bring in other team members. By the time they finished, the sun was setting over the city, painting the office in warm gold. Marcus stood at the window, looking toward his neighborhood. From this height, he could just make out his apartment building, Mr. Chin's window where it had all started. Overwhelming, isn't it? Mr. Chin stood beside him. Change always is. What if I'm not ready? The elderly professor laughed softly. Ready? I wasn't ready to leave Hong Kong. Wasn't ready to become a professor. Wasn't ready to lose Margaret. He patted Marcus's shoulder. But here's what I learned. We're never really ready. We just take the leap and build our wings on the way down. Did Margaret say that too? No, that one's all mine. Mr. Chin winked. See? Old dogs, new tricks. David joined them at the window. The team's excited to start Monday. Think you can handle it? Marcus looked between the two men, the powerful CEO and the retired professor, father and son reunited by a simple act of kindness. He thought about his own father, about the lessons of helping others, about his mother's wisdom regarding balance. Yes, he said firmly. I can handle it. The city stretched out below them, millions of stories playing out in countless windows. Somewhere out there, another senior citizen was staring at a computer screen in frustration. Another family was trying to bridge the digital divide. Marcus Johnson, the kid who fixed computers to help pay bills, was about to help change that. One connection at a time. The Wong Technologies training room buzzed with nervous energy. 10 seniors sat at sleek computer stations, their faces a mix of anxiety and determination. At the front of the room, Marcus adjusted his tie. Another borrowed item, this time from David. "Ready?" Mr. Chen asked from his seat in the corner, where he'd insisted on positioning himself as assistant instructor. Marcus glanced at his notes one last time. This was the pilot group for their digital inclusion program, carefully selected from their neighborhood. He recognized most of them. Mrs. Liu from Mr. Chen's building, Mrs. Harrison, Mr. Patel from the corner store, and others he'd seen around but never spoken to. "Good morning, everyone," Marcus began, his voice steadier than he felt. "Welcome to Digital Bridges." From the observation room, behind one-way glass, David Wong watched with his executive team. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, but forced himself to focus on the familiar faces before him. "Before we start with any technology," Marcus continued, "I'd like to hear from each of you. What brought you here today? What do you hope to learn?" Mrs. Harrison raised her hand first, like a schoolgirl. "My grandchildren are always sending me links to, what do they call them? Memes? I want to understand what they're sharing." A ripple of laughter went through the room. The tension eased slightly. Mr. Patel spoke next. "My daughter is trying to help me set up online ordering for the store. But every time she explains, it goes too fast. One by one, they share their stories. Family overseas. Grandchildren growing up too quickly. Businesses trying to keep up with the digital age. Behind each technical challenge lay a human connection waiting to be strengthened." "Perfect," Marcus said, moving to the first computer station. "Let's start with something simple. Mr. Chen, would you like to demonstrate how to set up a video call?" The elderly professor practically bounced to the front of the room. "Ah, yes. First, you want to check your camera. See this little icon here?" Marcus watched as Mr. Chen guided the class through the basics, his teaching experience shining through as he related each step to real-world examples. The other seniors leaned forward, engaged by one of their peers showing them the way. In the observation room, Marcus could see David nodding approvingly. The morning passed quickly. By lunchtime, every participant had successfully made a video call, sent an email with an attachment, and navigated basic social media features. More importantly, they were helping each other, sharing tips, and laughing at common mistakes. During the lunch break, David entered the training room. "Impressive start. The team's particularly interested in your peer teaching approach." Marcus watched as Mr. Chen demonstrated something to Mrs. Liu, both of them chuckling over a shared joke. "It was his idea, actually. He said people learn better when they don't feel judged." Speaking of ideas, David pulled out his tablet. "The development team has some concerns about the program's scalability. They think we need more structured modules, standardized testing." "No," Marcus said firmly, surprising himself with his conviction. "That's exactly what doesn't work." David raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Marcus gestured to the room. "Look at them. They're not afraid anymore because we're treating them like people, not problems. The moment we start standardizing everything, we lose that connection. But for larger implementation, we can scale the framework while keeping it personal," Marcus insisted. "Train more facilitators like Mr. Chun, seniors who've gone through the program and can teach others. Build a network of peer instructors." David studied him thoughtfully. "The team won't like it. It's messier than their usual approaches. Sometimes messy is better." Marcus thought of his first afternoon with Mr. Chun, how a simple repair had turned into hours of stories and connection. Technology is clean and structured. People aren't. A slow smile spread across David's face. You remind me of someone." "Oh, my mother." David's eyes drifted to where his father was now showing Mrs. Harrison how to share photos. "She used to say that the best solutions come from understanding people, not just problems." The afternoon session focused on practical applications. Each participant brought a real-world challenge they wanted to solve. Mr. Patel worked on setting up an online ordering system for his store. Mrs. Harrison learned how to create a digital photo album for her grandchildren. Mr. Chen moved from station to station, offering encouragement and tips, his natural teaching abilities complementing Marcus's technical knowledge perfectly. By day's end, the room hummed with achievement. Mrs. Liu had successfully video called her son in California. Mr. Patel had the basics of his online store figured out. Mrs. Harrison proudly showed off her photo album. As the participants gathered their things, chatting excitedly about what they'd learned, David re-entered with his executive team. Ladies and gentlemen, he addressed the group, thank you for being our pilot class. Your feedback will be invaluable as we develop this program further. Mrs. Harrison stood up. Mr. Wong, can I say something? Of course. I've taken computer classes before at the library. Never understood a thing. But this. She gestured around the room. This was different. Having Mr. Chin here showing us it's possible, and Marcus explaining things in our language, not text speech. The other seniors nodded in agreement. David turned to his team. Still concerned about scalability? One executive cleared his throat. The peer instruction model would require significant coordination. I can help with that, Mr. Chin interrupted. I still know many retired teachers. People with experience making complex things simple. Marcus watched as the executives exchanged glances. He could see their doubt wavering in the face of the day's obvious success. After everyone had left, Marcus sat at one of the computer stations, exhausted but satisfied. Mr. Chun was gathering his things, humming quietly. You did well today, the elderly professor said. A natural teacher. I learned from the best. Marcus smiled. Thank you for jumping in like that. They really responded to you. Ah well, Mr. Chun adjusted his glasses. Teaching is like riding a bicycle. You never really forget. He paused. Though I never taught anyone to ride a bicycle. Margaret did that with Amy. I was too nervous she would fall. David appeared in the doorway. Ready for tomorrow? The team wants to review the curriculum based on today's results. Marcus stood, gathering his notes. Actually, I have an idea about that. What if we let today's participants help design the next modules? They know better than anyone what worked and what didn't. Unconventional, David mused. The development team will hate it. But, Marcus prompted. But my mother would have loved it. David smiled. Do it. Set up a focus group for next week. Let's build this program the right way, not just the easy way. As they left the training room, Marcus could see his reflection in the wall of windows. He hardly recognized himself in the borrowed tie and pressed shirt. But underneath the professional exterior, he was still the same person who'd stopped to help a frustrated neighbor. Sometimes he realized the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures. 3 months into the Digital Bridges program, the community center's computer lab had become a hub of activity. What started as a single class had grown into a movement, with seniors teaching seniors, forming their own digital support networks. Marcus stood in the doorway, watching Mrs. Liu guide a new participant through setting up a social media account. Her confidence had grown tremendously since that first nervous day in the Wong Technologies training room. Remember, she said in her gentle voice, profile pictures are like digital first impressions. Let's find one that shows your best smile. Mr. Chin appeared beside Marcus, beaming with pride. She's a natural teacher. Did you know she was a kindergarten teacher for 30 years? Really? That explains a lot. We have 5 former teachers in the program now, each bringing their own style, their own wisdom. The lab buzzed with conversation and occasional laughter. Mr. Patel's corner store now had a thriving online presence, managed entirely by himself with occasional help from his new digital friends, as he called them. Mrs. Harrison had become the unofficial photography expert, teaching others how to edit and share family photos. David Wong entered through the back door, dressed more casually than usual in a sweater and slacks. He'd been making these informal visits more frequently, often sitting in on sessions and taking notes. The board is impressed, he said quietly to Marcus. Engagement rates are higher than any previous digital literacy program they've seen. Marcus nodded toward where Mr. Chun was now demonstrating video call features to a new group. It's all about the approach. We're not teaching technology, we're teaching connection. Speaking of connection, David pulled out his tablet. Look at these numbers. The statistics were remarkable. Program participants were spending an average of 3 hours more per week in digital communication with family members. Online engagement in senior community groups had increased by 200%. Most surprisingly, 80% of participants had gone on to teach at least one other person what they'd learned. It's spreading organically, David continued. Other community centers are asking about implementing the program. We've had inquiries from 3 other cities. Marcus watched as Mrs. Harrison helped another senior set up a digital photo frame. What does the development team think? They're adjusting to the peer teaching model. David smiled wryly. It's messier than their usual metrics, but they can't argue with the results. A commotion near the front of the room drew their attention. Mr. Patel was showing everyone his store's first online order. A customer in another state who wanted his famous homemade samosas shipped to them. "You see?" he exclaimed excitedly. "My daughter was right. The internet makes my little store into a big store." The room erupted in applause. Mr. Chen wiped a tear from behind his glasses. "Marcus," David said, "we need to talk about expansion. The board wants to roll this out nationally. Already? But we're still fine-tuning the local program." "That's exactly why. They want to capture this magic while it's fresh, before it gets too polished, too corporate." Marcus thought about how it had all started. One frustrated neighbor, one act of kindness. Could that personal touch really be maintained on a national scale? As if reading his thoughts, Mr. Chun joined their conversation. "You know, when I first started teaching, I had the same worry. How could I connect with hundreds of students? But you learn that big changes happen one person at a time." A loud cheer interrupted them. Mrs. Liu had successfully helped her student upload a profile picture. The elderly woman was beaming at her own image on the screen, surrounded by supportive peers. "Look at that confidence," David murmured. 3 months ago, she was afraid to touch a computer. Marcus remembered the first day, how nervous everyone had been. Now the lab felt like a community center, a place where technology was just the medium for something much more important, human connection. "If we expand," Marcus said slowly, "we need to keep this feeling. This sense of community." "Agreed," David replied. "What do you suggest?" "We train the trainers first. Find more people like Mr. Chun, experienced educators who can adapt to technology. Then pair them with tech-savvy volunteers who have the patience to teach." Mr. Chin nodded enthusiastically. "I already have a list of retired teachers who've expressed interest. And some of our first graduates want to become instructors." "See?" David gestured around the room. "It's already happening naturally. We just need to provide the framework, the resources." A local news crew had set up in one corner, interviewing Mrs. Harrison about the program. She spoke confidently about how she now helped other grandparents connect with their families online. "I was so afraid of all this modern technology," she told the reporter. "But Mr. Chun and Marcus showed us that it's not about the computers. It's about the connections we make through them." The reporter turned to where Marcus stood with David and Mr. Chun. "Could we get a few words from the program creators?" David stepped forward, but Marcus held back. "This isn't about us," he said quietly. "Let them tell their stories." They watched as Mrs. Harrison continued her interview, joined by Mr. Patel and Mrs. Liu. Each shared their journey from digital anxiety to confidence, from isolation to connection. "You know what this reminds me of?" Mr. Chin said softly. "My first year teaching. I was so worried about my accent, about students understanding me. But then I realized, if you teach from the heart, the words find their way." Marcus looked around the room, at the seniors helping seniors, at the natural flow of learning and sharing, at the community that had formed around something as simple as learning to use technology. "From the heart," he repeated. "That's what we need to maintain as we grow. The technology is just the tool. The heart is what matters." David made some notes on his tablet. "I'll have the team draft an expansion proposal based on this model. Peer teaching, community building, organic growth, and story sharing," Marcus added. "Each location needs to capture and share their success stories. Not just statistics, but real human connections being made." As if on cue, Mr. Chin's phone chimed. It was Amy, calling for their daily video chat. Without missing a beat, he answered, holding up the phone to show her the busy computer lab. "Look, sweetheart, your old dad's become a tech teacher." Amy's laughter rang out from the speaker. "Dad, you're famous. We saw the program mentioned in the Singapore news." The news crew immediately gravitated toward this perfect illustration of the program's impact. A father confidently using technology to share his achievements with his daughter across the globe. Marcus stepped back, letting the scene unfold naturally. David stood beside him, watching his father proudly show off his teaching skills to Amy. "You know," David said quietly, "when Mom died, I thought I'd lost both parents. Dad was so withdrawn, so disconnected. Now look at him. He just needed the right bridge," Marcus replied. "We all do." David turned to him. "Ready to help build more?" Marcus watched as Mrs. Liu taught another senior how to share photos, as Mr. Patel excitedly showed his online store to the news crew, as Mr. Chen beamed at his daughter through the phone screen. One connection at a time, they were building something remarkable, something that went far beyond technology. Ready, he said. The Wong Technologies auditorium was packed. 6 months into the Digital Bridges program, representatives from 20 cities had gathered for the first national conference. Marcus stood backstage, adjusting his new tie. This one actually his own, a gift from his mother to mark the occasion. Nervous? Mr. Chen appeared beside him, dapper in a freshly pressed suit. Terrified, Marcus admitted. All these important people. Important? Mr. Chen chuckled. Look out there. Who do you see? Marcus peeked through the curtain. The audience was a mix of ages and backgrounds, but what caught his attention were the familiar faces. Mrs. Harrison sat in the front row, teaching another elderly woman how to use the conference's mobile app. Mr. Patel was showing his phone to a group of business owners, presumably displaying his now thriving online store. I see our community, Marcus said softly. Exactly. The suits and titles don't matter. What matters is... A commotion at the back of the auditorium interrupted him. David Wong was escorting someone through the doors. A young woman, clearly pregnant, supported by an older gentleman. Amy? Mr. Chen's voice cracked. But she wasn't supposed to fly in until next week. Surprise! David grinned, approaching backstage. Thought you might want your whole family here for this. Marcus watched as Mr. Chen rushed to embrace his daughter, tears flowing freely behind his glasses. Amy's husband, a kind-faced man named Michael, stood nearby, recording the moment on his phone. Dad, Amy said, wiping her own eyes, you look so handsome. And Marcus. She hugged him too, her pregnancy bump between them. Thank you for taking care of my father. He's taken care of all of us, Marcus replied, gesturing to the crowded auditorium. David checked his watch. 5 minutes until we start. Everyone ready? Marcus took a deep breath, looking at his notes one last time. The presentation they'd prepared told the story of digital bridges, not through statistics and flowcharts, but through the real experiences of their participants. The lights dimmed. David took the stage first, his presence commanding immediate attention. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 months ago, we launched a program based on a simple idea. Technology should connect, not divide. We expected to teach digital skills. What we didn't expect was to build a movement. The screen behind him lit up with photos, seniors teaching seniors, family video calls, online community groups. Each image represented a bridge built, a connection made. But rather than tell you about it myself, David continued, I'd like to introduce the people who made it happen. Starting with the young man who inspired it all by helping my father with a broken computer. Marcus walked onto the stage, his nervousness fading as he saw the encouraging smiles from familiar faces in the audience. Digital Bridges began with a choice, he started. A choice between making money fixing a computer and helping a neighbor in need. He glanced at Mr. Chen, who beamed proudly. I chose connection over profit. What I didn't know was that choice would lead to something much bigger. The next hour passed in a blur of presentations. Mr. Chen spoke about the peer teaching model, his natural educator's passion shining through. Mrs. Harrison shared her journey from tech-phobic grandmother to digital mentor. Mr. Patel demonstrated how the program had transformed his small business. But the most powerful moment came during Amy's unplanned speech. A year ago, she said, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, I felt like I was losing my father to isolation. Today, he's not just my dad. He's a teacher, a community leader, and soon a grandfather who'll be able to share every moment with his grandchild, no matter the distance. The audience wiped tears as Amy showed a montage of video calls with her father. From the early, frustrating attempts to recent clips of him confidently using multiple features, teaching others, building his digital community. During the reception that followed, Marcus found himself surrounded by officials from other cities, all eager to implement the program in their communities. The key, he explained repeatedly, is keeping it personal. Technology is just the tool. Connection is the goal. His mother arrived late, still in her nurse's scrubs, having come straight from her shift. Sarah Johnson stood at the back of the room, watching her son with tears of pride. "He would have been so proud, Mrs. Harrison said, joining her. "Your husband?" Sarah nodded. "He always said Marcus had a gift for helping others. I just worried that he'd work himself too hard." Mrs. Harrison smiled. "Look at him now. He's not just helping others, he's teaching them to help themselves." Across the room, Mr. Chun was introducing Amy to every member of his digital seniors group, his face glowing with joy. David stood nearby, watching his father's transformation with quiet satisfaction. "Marcus," David called, waving him over. "The board wants to discuss next steps. They're talking about international expansion." Before Marcus could respond, Mr. Chin spoke up. "First, we celebrate. Margaret always said, big decisions can wait for joy," David finished, smiling. "Yes, Dad, you're right." The reception turned into an impromptu party. Someone started playing music through the conference sound system. Mrs. Liu taught everyone a simple Chinese dance. Mr. Patel ordered samosas from his store using his new delivery app. Marcus found a quiet moment to stand by the window, looking out at the city lights. His reflection showed someone different from the struggling student of a year ago. Same face, same kind eyes, but something had changed. "Penny for your thoughts?" His mother appeared beside him. "Just thinking about Dad. About how he always said small kindnesses matter more than big gestures." Sarah hugged him. "He was right. Look what your small kindness started." Across the room, Amy was showing Mr. Chin ultrasound photos on her phone. The elderly professor was teaching everyone how to zoom in on the image, his teaching skills seamlessly blending with his grandfatherly pride. "Marcus?" David approached, holding his tablet. "Sorry to interrupt, but there's something you should see." The screen showed emails from senior centers around the world, England, Japan, Australia, all asking about digital bridges. "It's spreading," David said simply. "The world is ready for what we've built here." Marcus looked around the room, at the community that had formed, the bridges that had been built, the generations connected through technology and compassion. "No," he said softly. "We didn't build this. We just showed people how to build it themselves." The night continued, a celebration of connection in all its forms. Traditional dances met modern technology as seniors recorded each other on their phones. Stories were shared, both in person and through video calls with participants from other cities. And in the middle of it all, a young man who'd once fixed a broken computer watched as his small act of kindness rippled outward, touching lives in ways he'd never imagined possible. 1 year to the day since Marcus had first knocked on Mr. Chin's door, the neighborhood had transformed. The community center's computer lab had expanded to 3 rooms. Mr. Patel's store had become a successful e-commerce hub, shipping his famous samosas nationwide. Mrs. Harrison ran a thriving digital photography club for seniors. Marcus sat in his new office at Wong Technologies, surrounded by thank you cards and photos from Digital Bridges participants around the world. His graduation gown hung on the door. He'd finished his degree a semester early, thanks to the program's flexible schedule. A knock at his door. Mr. Chin entered, followed by Amy, who was carrying her 2-month-old daughter, Lily. "Ready for the anniversary celebration?" Mr. Chin asked, bouncing lightly on his feet with characteristic enthusiasm. "Almost." Marcus gathered his notes. "How's our newest tech enthusiast?" Amy laughed, adjusting Lily in her arms. "Dad's already teaching her to video chat. She recognizes his face on the screen now." "Of course she does." Mr. Chun beamed. "She's a Chun. Technology is in her blood." The community center was packed when they arrived. Participants from the past year had gathered to celebrate, along with representatives from Digital Bridges programs in other cities. The walls were covered with before and after stories, photos and testimonials showing the program's impact. David Wong stood at the podium, more casual than usual in a sweater that Marcus recognized as a Christmas gift from his father. 1 year ago, David began, a young student made a choice that would change countless lives. He chose connection over convenience, compassion over profit. Marcus felt his mother's hand slip into his. Sarah Johnson had traded her nurse's scrubs for an elegant dress, though she still wore the practical shoes of someone used to long shifts. "But this isn't just about one choice," David continued. It's about the thousands of choices made by everyone in this room. The choice to learn something new, the choice to teach others, the choice to bridge the gap between generations. Mr. Chin took the stage next, holding Lily while he spoke. The image of the elderly professor cradling his granddaughter while confidently using the presentation remote epitomized everything Digital Bridges stood for. When my Margaret passed away, he said, his voice soft but clear, I thought technology was pushing me further into isolation. Now I understand technology is like any tool. Its value lies in how we use it. The presentation screen showed clips from the past year. Mrs. Liu teaching Chinese cooking classes over video chat. Mr. Patel mentoring other small business owners in digital marketing. Mrs. Harrison's photography being featured in a digital art exhibition. Today, Mr. Chin continued, I don't just see my granddaughter through a screen. I see a future where distance doesn't mean disconnection, where age doesn't mean isolation. Marcus watched as the audience nodded, many wiping tears. These weren't just program participants anymore. They were a community bound together by more than just shared learning. David returned to the podium. We have an announcement to make. The board has approved the international expansion of Digital Bridges. By this time next year, we'll have programs running in 50 countries. Applause filled the room. Marcus felt a mix of pride and apprehension. How could they maintain the program's personal touch on such a scale? As if reading his thoughts, Mr. Chin handed Lily back to Amy and approached the microphone. But we'll never forget how this started. With one neighbor helping another. One connection leading to many. The celebration continued with a series of demonstrations. Seniors who'd once feared touching a computer now confidently showed off their digital skills. Family members joined via video calls from around the world, their faces projected on the walls like windows into other worlds. During a quiet moment, Marcus slipped away to the original computer lab where it had all begun. The old desktop where he'd first helped Mr. Chin still sat by the window, now used to teach newcomers. Feeling nostalgic? David joined him, 2 cups of coffee in hand. Just thinking about how it all started, Marcus accepted the coffee. Did you know this was going to happen? When you first offered me the job? David leaned against the desk. I hoped. Mom always said the best solutions come from the heart, not the boardroom. When I saw how you helped Dad, he paused. The corporate team wanted to launch a traditional digital literacy program. All metrics and milestones. But you showed us a better way. Through the window, they could see Mr. Chin in the main room, showing Lily off to his digital seniors group via tablet. The baby gurgled at the screen, reaching for the familiar faces she'd grown to know through technology. Wong Technologies' stock has risen 15% since we launched Digital Bridges, David said. The board is thrilled. But that's not what matters. What matters? Look out there. Really look? Marcus observed the scene. Mrs. Harrison was teaching a photography class, her students a mix of seniors and young people. Mr. Patel discussed online business strategies with a group of local shop owners. Mrs. Liu led a digital storytelling workshop, helping others preserve their family histories. I see it, Marcus said softly. It's not about the technology anymore. It's about the community we built around it. Exactly. David checked his phone. Speaking of community, it's time for your surprise. My what? The lights dimmed. The main screen lit up with a global video call, Digital Bridges participants from every program location. Faces filled the screen. Elderly learners from Tokyo, peer teachers from London, community organizers from Sydney. Marcus Johnson, David announced, meet your extended family. One by one, they shared their stories. How Digital Bridges had changed their communities. How the peer teaching model had restored dignity and purpose to retired educators. How intergenerational connections had flourished through technology. Marcus felt overwhelmed. His mother appeared beside him, squeezing his hand. Dad would have loved this, she whispered. Mr. Chin approached with Lily, who was falling asleep in his arms. You know what Margaret would say about all this? What? She would say we've built something better than bridges. We've built homes, digital spaces where generations connect, where wisdom meets innovation, where distance disappears. The evening wound down with a final announcement. David revealed that Wong Technologies was establishing the Margaret Chin Fellowship for Digital Inclusion, providing resources for communities to start their own Digital Bridges programs. And our first fellow, David concluded, will be Marcus Johnson, who showed us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the world. Later, as the celebration ended, Marcus stood again by the window where he'd first seen Mr. Chin struggling with his computer. The street looked different now, not just because of the physical changes to the community center, but because of how he saw it. Every window represented a potential connection. Every frustrated senior citizen was a future teacher. Every piece of technology was a bridge waiting to be built. "Ready to go home?" his mother asked. "Almost." Marcus watched as Mr. Chin said goodbye to Amy and Lily, his tablet already set up for tomorrow morning's video call. The elderly professor joined them at the window. "You know, Marcus, a year ago, I sat here feeling lost in the digital age. Now," he smiled, showing them his phone screen, filled with messages, photos, and video call notifications. "Now I have to remind myself to log off sometimes." They laughed together, 3 generations connected by a simple act of kindness that had grown into something extraordinary. As they left the community center, Marcus looked back one last time. Through the window, he could see the next day's class schedule displayed on a digital board, Digital Bridges, connecting hearts through technology. It had started with a broken computer and a frustrated professor. It had grown into a global movement. But at its heart, it remained what it had always been: one person helping another, one connection at a time. The future stretched out before them, full of possibilities, bridges waiting to be built. And somewhere, Marcus knew, Margaret Chin was smiling.